Welcome to Talent Talks. It's our brand new webinar series designed for forward-thinking business leaders. In this series, we'll delve deep into the multifaceted talent challenges that are pivotal to scaling and enhancing companies in today's dynamic business environment. In each episode, I plan to pull together a panel of leading figures within their respective fields to gain insights from their experiences and expertise. Expect a vibrant mix of real-world examples, strategic discussions, and thought-provoking debates. And in this first episode today, we're looking specifically at how to build and maintain high-performing teams. And what an amazing panel I have for this first episode. So thanks so much for joining me, everybody. Just before I'll allow the panel to introduce themselves shortly, but just a quick intro from me. My name's Alex Whiffin. I'm Managing Director and co-founder of Cherry Pick People. We're a talent consultancy specialising in the real estate and prop tech sectors. I've over 15 years in the talent space and I've advised hundreds of businesses, large and small, on how to refine their talent processes, helping them develop robust strategies, talent strategies, processes to ultimately attract, engage, and retain the best people. Just before I allow the panelists to introduce themselves, I just want to say that obviously this is a live webinar and would love people to get involved. If you can post and say hi, or maybe tell us where you're from. It'd be great to know where people are watching from. That would be fantastic. And more importantly, I really would love to have questions and comments from the audience, and I will try and field as many as possible to our esteemed panel. So yeah, please do not hesitate to get involved. I'll field as many questions as I can. Mickey, do you want to introduce yourself first, before we get stuck into the first questions?
Absolutely. So I'm Mickey Rooney. I'm relatively new to the property sector because I had a previous career in the military where I was one of the badged rocket scientists, and I got to head up part of the complex weapons program and work with technology to the nth degree. Following my time in the military, I came into the built environment like many others by accident, and then I worked through a number of directorships and companies, largely with a focus on transformation, introducing technology, but also introducing the processes of how you use those technologies. One, to improve place, improve the people experience, and then it's always important to the enterprise to improve profit. And because of that, I've then had the privilege of working with lots of different types of teams, some high performing, some have been on a journey to get high performing, but all of them have exposed me to incredible individuals with fantastic energy and a real drive to make a difference to the planet.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mickey. Bronnie, do you want to go next?
Good morning. So I'm Bronnie Wilson. I work for Equium. We're a prop tech company, and we provide workplace platforms primarily to landlords and managing agents of commercial, co-working, and some occupiers and mixed use. Essentially, we help landlords to connect and communicate with their building occupiers with the aim of increasing tenant retention and attraction. And we also have a whole suite of workplace management tools, such as visitor management, contractor management, help desk, access control. And we work with a lot of our customers on integrations to bring a lot of their property platforms together. I've been at Equium for 10 years, first in Australia, hence the accent, and for the last 6+ years based here in London. I've led teams in my career ranging from 170 people to 2 people, and currently manage teams across the UK and the countries we operate in Europe, so about 22 countries in total. So very, very interesting journey for Equium and for myself.
Amazing. Thanks, Bronnie. And finally, last but not least, David, tell us about your...
Morning, Alex, and morning to everybody that's listening. David Oates, currently at Yavica, which is a Danish property ERP system sitting on top of Dynamics, Microsoft Dynamics. My background is 30 years in software, the last 20 of which have been in senior leadership roles. And in the built environment, I ran international for the Altus Group. I was on the board and CRO at Coyote Software, part of the M7 and Oxford Group, and also helped to get Proda from pre-revenue to where they are today. So delighted to be here. I've worked with teams a bit like Bronnie and with Mickey to a certain extent, from 3 or 4 people up to almost 100 people. So seen a bit, learnt a lot, and love the concept of high-performing teams.
Oh, fantastic! What an amazing panel to have today. So thanks again for joining me. Let's get stuck into this. So, I mean, my first question to the panel is, what are the defining characteristics of a high-performing team, and why are they important for organisations? Mickey, do you want to kick us off with this one?
Yeah, sure. In truth, for the audience and likewise for Bronnie and David, there's probably about 1,000 different answers depending on what your experiences are. But if we try and boil it down for my experience, there's probably 3 tenets that you look for. One is alignment to the endeavour. So is there clarity of purpose provided or generated by the group that people will genuinely align by? And whether that's a strategy or a plan, is that everybody does align behind the direction you're going, the thing you're trying to achieve. Second to that, and it probably is the most important one, is the capabilities to execute. And all too often we see good plans and really good visions, but execution is missing. And there's actually, I think it's one of David's favourite books, Who Says Elephants Can't Dance, where Lou Gerstner experienced that at IBM, where there was incredible intelligence and incredible capability, but there was a real lack of ability to execute, to work the problem, to have the responsibility to own the outcome, including there'll be a non-linear path, and therefore you have to stick the course. And then I think the last one, if we use the E's, is the evaluation. You've got to be open to the fact that you will experience failures. You've got to be open to the fact that you don't know everything, and therefore 2 ears, 1 mouth. The stronger teams have the ability to utilize where their strengths are, and then look to get support from the wider community where their weaknesses are, and we've all got them. And John Harvey Jones, for those that have ever looked at his background and how he turned ICI around, he utilized something he'd pulled from his military days called the OODA loop, where you build into the routine an ability to observe, to orientate the information you've got, make a decision and act. High-performing teams are those that are able to run a number of OODA loops, because you will have people with their areas to look at, but the ones that can run the shorter loop, how quickly can you go from observation to action, normally allows you to perform at a higher level, because you can de-stress, or indeed you can look for support to achieve the outcome. You can also work out what's not working and stop wasting energy on it. And it acts like a really short truth engine. So when you look at, I've mentioned 2 there that you could look at with IBM's turnaround and ICI, but you look where high-performing teams achieve good outputs, and that seems to be a core component of how they achieved it. But I'm sure Bronnie and David will have some thoughts on that with their experiences.
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything you say, Alex. I think there's a couple of other things that I would add into that. I think for me, high-performing teams have always had 2 key things on top of what you've just said. One is a trust in not just the purpose, but in each other. And I think that's highly critical. And we'll probably talk about that again later, because it's a special forces model of performance and trust. And the other thing is desire. A desire to never stop learning, whether that's self-improvement or through the leadership providing that capability. And also a desire to win as a team. High-performing teams, for me, one of the key words in that is team. It's not about individual success; it's about team success. And I think that those two facets are really important in high-performing teams moving forward.
100% agree. I think the purpose, both of you have mentioned purpose in your opening sentence, which I think is critical. along with, high levels of collaboration, that teamwork and communication. I also think, it's really important in high performing teams to have complementary skills and attitudes, and also diversity in all its forms. So diversity of thinking and background and experience. I think for me, the things that I really focus on in building teams is, on one hand, the focus and the purpose and the priorities, why we're here, what we're working on, and making sure that everybody's aligned in that. And when the individuals win, the company wins, and vice versa. And that each of our teams are aligned with purpose and how they contribute. And, removing that kind of siloed working that means that some teams can have completely different priorities. And there's a big piece in those wins being shared, and acknowledgement across the entire organisation, for progress and wins of how each team's contributed. And the other part is culture. I think you just mentioned, David, that high trust, which I think is critical to high performing teams, right? The ability to run quickly, to make decisions quickly, to have effective processes in place that allow a team to remain agile, requires a lot of trust. It requires trust in each other to not have to micromanage or be involved in every decision, and to be able to trust that the colleagues are going to make the right decisions and we can move forward. And the psychological safety of, teams feeling like they can bring their whole self to work, that they can be authentic, that they can put their hand up if they're struggling with workload or stress or burnout or personal issues or mental health, and to be able to say, I'm going to tap out of this, or I need a break, or I'm overwhelmed, and knowing that their colleagues are going to jump in and pick up the slack and carry things forward. I think that's hugely important. Communication, as you said, David, is a place we do a lot of work with our teams. Recognition and support, and resilience. We do a lot of work at Equium on understanding resilience and working on building not necessarily resilient individuals, but resilient teams and a resilient organisation. Because, as we've seen over the last few years, it's just been a critical aspect of getting us through the pandemic and all of the financial ups and downs, as a business. And to your question, Alex, why? All the data shows that cohesive teams create more profitable businesses. So, if we're looking at it purely from the bottom line, the data is there.
Well, exactly. I'm sure, everyone watching, that's the driver. But sometimes, quite often it's what are those attributes that really make a team go to the next level. There's a lot of teams out there that will probably be quite dysfunctional, and people are trying their best to build them effectively. So, learning from you guys about what those key things are, and there's a few themes that come up there in terms of vision and purpose and trust, and a sort of vulnerability maybe tied into that, because you need to have the trust there to be able to show your vulnerable side. And be interesting to maybe dig into that a little bit more further into the webinar. I suppose before we get into maybe some of the obstacles that some of the business leaders might be facing, I'd be interested to know from you guys what you feel the key differences are between maybe a traditional approach and modern approach to team building, and how these have evolved over time, because that might give us a bit of a basis to explore further what good really looks like, and how people can build those teams effectively. So, who would like to take this one?
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at this, Alex.
Go on. Yeah.
Having been in the software industry for a long period of time, you don't get a bald head and a grey beard for nothing. When I started out, way back in the 80s, it was very much a command and control model. Everything came from the top. We, as salespeople or marketing staff or whatever, were basically sheep to a certain extent. We were told what to do. We were given targets. We were told how to do it. We were reviewed at a micro level. When I remember days of having reviews with my boss where I had to take my diary in and go through it and show him where I'd been. And it was very much, there are still some companies that run like this, and I don't agree with it necessarily, but there are, it's how many calls have you made today? How many meetings have you been to? How many proposals have you written? Etc. 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 And that was a very much that command and control model, and that was probably effective in the 80s. It was the era of the yuppie and the Thatcher generation, and all chasing the dollar, and that was the way we did it at the time. I think one of the things I found very hard to adjust to, but have obviously come around to that way of thinking over the last 5-10 years, is that much more collaborative approach and much more of an open dialogue approach, where leadership sets the vision, sets the purpose, and then trusts people and empowers people to deliver on that purpose. We were chatting before the webinar started about, and then Mickey brought it up again later, about the difference between vision and execution. We maybe have lost some of that execution because we've gone too open in our approach. We've allowed people too much room to do their own thing. So, I think there is a middle ground here somewhere, but I do like the fact that collaborative approach means we get a much better spread of ideas, a much broader set of strategies, and most importantly, people are willing to have their own opinion. And that's definitely a big change. And, I'm sure we'll get into diversity and we'll get into the way teams function. But I think, 40, 30 years ago, we weren't necessarily, as staff members, allowed to have those opinions. Or if we had them, we had to keep them to ourselves.
Yeah, so
that's a big shift.
Yeah, which is, I'm sure, is incredibly positive for a lot of businesses, and certainly helps with engagement of your teams, and maybe in a different sort of talent market where there's record levels of employment and things like that. There's a different onus and pressure on businesses as well. They need to listen. They need to retain people. They need to listen to people. Anything to add, Mickey, on the
I think David's point's really interesting when you look at the two models of hierarchical cooperation, which is largely how lots of businesses still operate that way. I've just been in a business that was very much structured that way, and it worked because the thing they're delivering is action-centered leadership requirement. It's you've got to do this thing by that time. We're not innovating. We don't need to be imaginative. We're paid to do a thing, so we do the thing. You've then got other areas, especially around when you look at how software went from a kind of waterfall development to agile, which needed to open communication because your OODA loop is much faster, and therefore you need challenges to it. And I think there's a really good example, because we're talking about when teams are successful. Sometimes you learn when teams aren't successful and aren't high performing, and we discussed it a little bit yesterday. But there's one that we're watching on the news. And people have various views about it, about how the government and the structure underneath the government, they genuinely struggled to cope with an onslaught of a crisis, which, yes, it was once in a generation experience, but actually when you look in retrospect, we're all afforded 2020 vision, all the signs were there that there was a better way to deal with it, far better way, about being faster, about being able to challenge what was being set as a forced status quo. And Boris Johnson was on, on the TV for the news snippets last night, where he'd said he'd set a way in which they were doing their briefing. But the briefing seemed to be, it was going to come from the top and you were going to do as I say. And at no point did the team, who may be holding more information, feel as though that culture, which were obviously not a trust culture, allowed them to challenge it, because there were a number of alternatives that needed to be considered. And then there's another part that points out there, which is kind of an area I'm looking at really deeply, is where we sit within our organizations with underpinning knowledge and understanding, especially as we're seeing digital capabilities expand. We're seeing greater diversity in thought as well as greater diversity in culture. And therefore, people need to open a few books a bit more. And Charlie Munger, one of the partners at Berkshire Hathaway, he was big thing on that was find time, read a book, learn. Because it'll turn out you don't know as much as you think you know, and the whole thing is a learning journey. And I think too often people get to a position, get a title, it's a fairly nice salary, but we fail to engage on constantly learning. And the cooperative engagement allows for that. It encourages it. So it encourages challenge within bounds, but it should mean people come away going, actually, I didn't know that. And therefore I am going to have to go and find a few more facts and figure to reload my computer because I don't know everything I thought I knew.
Yeah, there's a good friend of mine who's an educationalist. He works with head teachers and top schools and so on. And he makes a point that and this is something I think to bear in mind for the future, we have stopped teaching critical thinking in school. So the up and coming workforce doesn't always have the ability to think critically and therefore challenge opinion. And I think that's something we need to be aware of moving forward. Else we'll be having this discussion in 15 years. Well, I won't, but having this discussion in 15 years and we'll still be having the same problem. Right? We'll still be trying to figure out how to build high performing teams because nobody can challenge. They've lost the ability to challenge.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, do we see that, these other the sort of new challenges coming about because of, maybe the circumstances people are in or different shifts in, the wider culture? There's positive opportunities, but, maybe other dangers there as well in doing things a different way. It leads me on to, and perhaps Bronnie, you can help, but start with this one. But what are some of the common obstacles or challenges that you've encountered when striving for high performance? How can they be overcome? I'm just thinking, actually, just to reference Jonathan G, who has put a question in there about also thoughts on inherited teams. So, there's some certainly challenges there when you're coming and taking over a team, and how do you change that around? That's a challenge.
I mean, I think the changes in work that we've seen over the pandemic have really created challenges in building high-performing teams. I'll be the first to put my hand up and say, up until the pandemic, I'd always led teams that were at least in my country, if not in the city or in traveling distance. And I hadn't managed remote teams. I hadn't managed hybrid teams. We'd always had a lot of flexibility. But you could get FaceTime with people whenever you needed it. And so I think there's a lot of people like myself who have had to adjust the ways of leading teams and the tools that we use to an online environment. I have a team in Europe now that are fully remote. They've always been fully remote. And my toolkit of things that I would use for the teams that I worked with who I saw in the office just don't work in the same way. And so, I rely quite heavily on face-to-face time, on physical team building, bringing people together socially, celebrating, all of the holidays we have. And that just doesn't work. And so I think, largely we're all adjusting to this and understanding how to work with teams remotely and still build the same kind of high trust relationships, to have that same kind of communication and open forums that we've had in a physical sense. And it's, I feel like for remote teams, it's more important than ever to get those high trust relationships. And, I see some of the challenges with individuals feeling the need to over communicate and continually be reporting on the work they do because they feel that they're invisible unless they do, and I look at this as from my perspective, there's a lot of time wasted in people validating that they're doing the work rather than just chasing the results. But that's, that kind of high trust of, I don't need to hear from you unless you need me. I trust that you're doing your job. I don't mind if you're working at, 6 a.m. and leaving at 3, or you're coming in at 10 and leaving at 6. It's irrelevant. But that's really hard for remote teams. And to the question that just popped up, it's also a real challenge when you inherit a team. It takes a lot of time and thought and focus on building those relationships and understanding who's in the team and what their capabilities are, and how to get that team to operate as a team together. One of the things that I think we've started doing, which is really important to hybrid and remote teams, is making sure that people are working on projects outside of the teams that they sit in, hierarchical, taking people from more junior roles over here and putting them with execs over here and engineers here, and getting them working on things together so that we've got that cross-team collaboration, and we're building networks and connections, because it's very easy for people working remotely to just work, with the small teams that they're involved in and their managers and direct reports. So I think that's one of the key challenges we have, certainly.
Definitely. I think, the last few years has been, has brought that about and magnified that even more so. Mickey, David, have you guys had experiences in managing remote teams? I mean, have you, advice on how you build those? Does the trust need to start face to face? Do you need to do that? What are the potential solutions?
So I agree with a lot of what Bronnie said. However, the one thing I'm not sure I do agree with is that I don't need to speak to you too often. I think with remote teams, and I've managed teams across the globe, when you've got time zone differences as well, which makes it challenging. And then, of course, we all went through the pandemic where we didn't see anybody for 6 months. So we did everything Zoom, or Teams became the way of communicating. For me, with remote teams, I actually think over-communicating is a really important part of it. Even if that's a 2-minute phone call to say, are you okay? Is there anything you need? Not just to pick up the phone and go, tell me about this deal, tell me about where you are on this project. My approach is always, tell me how I can help with that project. Are there any?
David, that's less over communicating though, isn't it? That is communicating. I think Bronnie's point would be, and I've done this today and I've done that today. You don't want a homework report every day.
Absolutely.
Because it starts to resonate. They're not trusting.
It's the reporting.
That's a journey.
The reporting up the line.
Yeah.
To demonstrate that I'm doing the work that is unnecessary. But you need to create the trust so that person doesn't feel like they've got to validate that they're working. And I think that's the insecurity of people remote working versus physically. But I agree with you, David, about the communication. You've got to have, I pick up the phone regularly.
Absolutely. Because part of it, and part of the challenge of a remote team, and it's even more so today because of what we've been through, is I've seen situations where people don't feel part of the team. And we've all worked in businesses in the last 3 years where we've never met half the people we work with.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. Because how many people do you meet and they go, when you do meet them in person, they go, wow, you're way bigger than I thought you were, or you're way shorter than I thought you were. It's because we're all used to just a head on a screen, and I'm quite tall.
Absolutely.
So after the COVID bit, you met people and they were like, oh wow, you're really tall. I thought you were kind of 5'6".
Yeah, they don't say that to me. Oh, you're really fat. Quite a lot. No, that's been a challenge. I mean, I was at a kickoff event in the States 18 months ago, and I didn't know 3/4 I'd never met 3/4 of the people there, and yet I'd spoken to them for 2 years. And that is a challenge. I remember, during the pandemic, we had a couple of employees that were, first of all, they weren't English, they weren't British, but they were living in London. They were here working, and they were living in flats, in wherever, Stratford or wherever. And we had to really be conscious of the fact that they were going to have mental health problems because they weren't seeing anybody. They were living alone, they were away from the family. And that's one of the things for me with remote teams is, and you touched on it earlier, Bronnie, you do have to be conscious of some of the mental health pressures that attracts. Yeah. Solo working, I mean, I'm extrovert. In fact, I think all of us on this call are. Complete remote working. The pandemic nearly killed me. Not being able to go and see people. And you have to be conscious of that in remote teams.
Yeah.
How
less visible.
How do you overcome it though? I mean, I know I've seen you, Bronnie, with your teams, and I can see how tight you are as a group when I've seen you in person. I can see how that FaceTime is so important. But obviously, you don't get it very often. It helps to build it, and maybe Teams is a great way to maintain it. But do you need that face-to-face contact?
It's not needed. For me, it's it's a real nice to have, and I think it speeds that up. You know, when we acquired Space OS back in May, we brought the whole team together in Warsaw, and for a lot of them, it had been the first time they met, and it was a really exciting time. And the feedback I've had after that is the relationship strengthened, and they now feel more safe and open to ask people for favors or to talk about what's happening in their personal life, which helps to build trust and helps people to work together. So it does speed up that process. It's not necessary. I think to the point about, you know, mental health, it's definitely less visible when you're working remotely. It's much harder for me to pick up if someone's struggling than it is when I see someone in the office, and particularly with time zones, it adds another layer. And so I think it's really important as a company from the top to have, you know, a culture that everybody knows that mental health is supported. We have, you know, employee assistance programs. We have mental health services available for people face to face and online. And we talk about it, and we talk about it openly. I talk about it. We talk about neurodiversity. We talk about mental health. And you need to create an environment where people are comfortable to say to their manager or colleagues, not having a great day, not putting my camera on today, I'm going to tap out at this meeting, or I'm going to take some time off to spend, you know, at home or with my family. And you need to make that a safe place for people to do that without questions being asked or about judgment. You know, we work really hard. There's a lot of expectation on our teams to deliver. And I think there are times when people have to put in extra effort at work. And I think the flip side of that is as a company culture and as leaders, you have to encourage your team to take that time back and to, you know, take time off when they need it, making sure people are taking their annual leave. We have wellbeing days that people can take when they need it. And I think that's really important. Because it's easy to miss it.
Yeah, and this section started out with what's changed. That's changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and we need to be more conscious of that with, like, say, people working remotely. I mean, Mickey, you must have run lots of teams remotely over the years, and you know, to throw something else into this remote discussion, what about the flip side? I mean, I'm sure there's managers and business leaders out there saying, oh, it's all well and good not having them reporting, but how do I know someone is actually doing their job and not just kick down the pub or kicking back or whatever? You know, how do I manage that fear for me as a business owner or as a team leader? How do I keep on top of that whilst maintaining trust and building that?
I think that's a really pertinent point, that last point you're making, with what we're seeing with the way businesses are trying to adjust to the new working norms. So some of the bigger organizations, in their mind, and it might be because they're pale, male and stale, or they're of an age where they were used to a certain construct of management, that they believe that high performance will be achieved by people being in the same space, by having those physical interactions, by being able to jump into a meeting room, resolve an issue, which moves things along faster, but also to be able to innovate and be able to cross talk. And there probably is going to be quite a lot of validity about that. And I think what we see over the next 24 months, and maybe we do revisit in 24 months, those companies, those groups that feel more compelled to go into a space more often and work within the same vicinity, if they're measured on where their performance is versus those that are, by the nature of the work they do, forced to stay completely remote, because that would give you some kind of, I guess, regulated measure on do we work better when we're remote. In terms of the question of manage remote teams, pretty much all my life it was my norm. So I was in the Royal Navy, where you would have your team on the ship, and I'm going to give you a lecture on the Navy, but a ship is made up of a number of specialists that come from other areas. So I was a weapons engineer, so we would have a weapons engineer department, but we were owned outside of the ship by a bigger organization. So we would collaborate for the period on the ship. You know, we allocated to one for a couple of years, maybe 3 years, depending if there's a war. But inevitably, you are remote to everything else that's happening that impacts your day-to-day. In some cases, so I was in, you know, for good reasons or bad, I was in quite a few wars. And that outside influence is happening minute by minute, especially now with the way you've got much more connected combat capability. And I guess one of the bigger ones where there was lots of remote teams where we were quite compressed on time was in Libya. So I was one of the component commanders for the activity in Libya, where we had a small cell that operated in London. So Northwood is where most of our activities operated from. And then we had an op cell on a ship in the middle of the Med. We had aircraft coming in from Cyprus, aircraft coming in from Italy. We were doing long haul from Gibraltar, flying stuff in from the UK. And because of the nature of what we did, we ran the British Indian Ocean territories, which is on a completely different time zone, quite hard to get rid of, which is where long-range Tomahawk missiles were being issued from. And that largely, people will have a different view, but in a military sense, that was a well-executed plan with a start, a middle, and a finish. There was really tight constraints about spend, about not putting boots on the ground, and also trying to absolutely limit and, if possible, remove collateral, which was largely going to be impossible because it's going to be kinetic interaction. But when you look at that as isolated, we went back afterwards and kind of did a review on it. It was quite successful. Now, the thing that had changed compared to previous interactions like Afghanistan, a little bit in the first Gulf War, was actually technology, because we could dial up with more confidence to a higher bandwidth. But someone's put a question, I think it's Joseph has put, about what measures organizations can implement. And actually, from my military experience, it was something over a long period of time about the terms you use. Yes, there was a hierarchy, but actually you could challenge in the hierarchy, which was really healthy. And there was kind of safe space to do that without seeing as though you were being impertinent. Building that into the teams that succeed takes time. And I think as the leader that will umbrella the protection on it, that's where you have to take a view on how much time you've got with whatever you do, in terms of how you define what your aims are, how you define agendas for a meeting, how you find one-to-one space, how you celebrate success, which Bronnie raised before. Do not underestimate that, even if it's a small thing, and mention the smallest cog in the machine. Because I tell you what, you take the smallest cog away from a machine, it turns out the whole thing comes to a grinding halt. And sometimes it can be a coder who's an introvert, and actually the thing they're doing is keeping the whole enterprise afloat. And again, from having this big, and it was a big team we're communicating through, it was pretty much 24/7. It was ensuring, even if it was a corporal that had called in with a drone, a review that actually enabled us to make a rapid decision and do things better, it was make sure that corporal got on his comms thing on his wrist, a BZ is what we used. And then coming into the commercial environment, it's trying to replicate that, which is not always easy because there's a number of agendas. And I guess the difference, it's an advantage the military have, is you are all of one company 24/7 contained, where obviously in a regular enterprise you're not. You go home at 5 o'clock and you've got a million other things to do, where you've got, especially nowadays with the noise of modern existence, you've got enough mental loading without constantly having to adjust to what work is thrown at you. So yes, my experience quite different, I think, from David and Bronnie, and it's bringing some of those experiences into the enterprises of work now. But the thing to consider is, and Bronnie, yeah, I think that's a really valid point you started off at the start of the session, that to celebrate success, and you build that into your general communication. It's amazing, the loyalty, the alignment, and also just the genuine effort people will bring to overcome some of the challenge we have nowadays with remoteness, and be brave enough to raise their hand to say, I think you're wrong. And that can be the most important conversation you have within an organization, because you know what, you probably are. And it's good when someone tells you are, in a polite way, and you'll go, why is that? Come to me with the case, but come to me with a solution, or at least the direction of the solution, because if I've got it wrong now, I'm not going to know.
And for that to be open across an entire organization. So, people are comfortable saying to the CEO, can I question that? Is hugely important. We do a lot of, all hands meetings. We had on this morning that everybody's invited to when there's a change in the organization, that anybody in the organization can quiz the CEO or the exec team about what this means.
And I think that's a really good point. And I think, you come back to your point, Mickey, about the smallest cog in the wheel. That smallest cog in the wheel, they're often the ones that are frightened to challenge the CEO, frightened to challenge the COO. And yet they might have the answer to the problem, whatever that problem might be. And I think fostering that, I was on the board at Coyote, and the CEO at Coyote, a guy called Ollie Farrago, built the whole culture on being, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to challenge. Don't be afraid to fail. We'll learn from whatever comes out of it. And that was one of the best cultures I've worked in. I mean, the CEO at Yavica, where I am now, Mads, is very similar. Just challenge me. I don't know everything. And I think any great leader, any good leader, and we talked about this yesterday when we sort of pre-briefed on this session, any good leader is open to learning every day. And it doesn't matter where that learning comes from. It can be books, or it could be your, I don't know, PA. It could be anybody. It doesn't matter. Everybody's entitled to an opinion, and everybody's going to have something useful to say along the way.
So fostering that culture of trust and the lack of fear of showing vulnerability, or and fear of failure almost is the same thing with the vulnerability. It's showing that you might be wrong, or you've done something wrong, or you feel like you might say the wrong thing. I mean, that actually reminds me, Jim Collins' Good to Great talks about level 5 leadership and the humble leader, which sounds like what you're talking about there, David. I mean, we haven't really touched on that in terms of the attributes of the leader of the team, because that it's obviously key to building a high performing team. What other attributes do you feel that a leader may need to portray to be successful and to build those teams successfully?
I think, for me, when you look at, building high performing teams, or, improving staff retention, which kind of underpins high performing teams, there's the old saying, people leave managers, not companies, which has a lot of truth in it. I think it's a bit more complex than that, but there's, certainly a reason that phrase exists. And some of the key things that people do leave for is growth, compensation, and relationships. Often that relationship is, direct management or senior leadership. So I think as leaders, there's a huge responsibility to ensuring that those things are in place for a team. Staff retention for me has been one of the key things that's helped me build high performing teams. We've traditionally had people stay a long time at Equium and grow pretty quickly through the ranks, sideways and upwards, which has helped to continue to build and maintain culture. And so, I guess I see as a leader, a huge part of my role is being a custodian for the culture, but also making sure that that's decentralized, that you don't have the exec team, at Equium saying this is the culture and everybody needs to live by this. It means decentralizing it, that everybody feels responsible for it, that everybody knows that they play a part in it, and actively builds and invests in that culture. And creating an environment where people can thrive. And so for me in leadership, a lot of my time is spent looking at resources and figuring out, are we creating the right opportunities for people to grow and develop? Are we giving people special projects? Are we creating pathways for progression? Are people looking after the right type of work? Is there something from this person's role that we could move to someone else to improve both of their career progression and opportunities? So I think, continually looking at that team and continually assessing, do we have the right people in the right roles, doing the right work for success for the company, but also success for each individual?
For me, one of the great skills of any leader is selling the vision.
That purpose alignment.
Selling the purpose, selling the vision, and getting people to believe in it. Great leaders don't lead people, they get people to follow them. Was said by somebody, I can't remember who, but
great.
It's I think it's critical that the leader is seen as credible, but most importantly, that they have purpose. They know where we're going. They don't always know how we're going to get there. They know where we're going. That's the starting point.
Starting with your why.
Sorry?
As Simon Sinek. Starting with why, as Simon Sinek would say. Yeah.
And actually, I think it was Carly asked a question. Are there particularly industries or sectors where high-performing teams present distinct challenges or advantages? I don't think there are, actually. I think high-performing teams can perform in any environment. You know, it doesn't matter what sector you're in, what industry you're in. And, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're selling warships or bars. You're not going to be successful without those high-performing teams. And, you know, the leader sets the tone for that. I mean, Mickey, from your military background, you must have seen great leaders and poor leaders because every industry's got them, right?
I'd say in the military, you see a much lower count of leaders, surprisingly, because the military operates on command. It's what you wear on your shoulders, and therefore do as I say, not as I do. But for those that are good, and you mentioned the kind of special forces, you know, being able to work with those with trust and potential rather than those with direct capability but lack of trust. That there's a great component when you look at those that have worked in those high pressure, highly intense periods, and they have a term, it's learned from wolves because nature can show us quite a lot, that the leader eats last. And if you consider that, a good leader is there to enable the success of everyone else.
Yeah.
And they should consider their own success just at the back of the line. So it is about enabling the conversations, the capability for individuals to growth, and provide an umbrella when you're saying to them, fail fast, but fail small. But ultimately, something's going to hit the fan if it's big enough. And if that's under, you know, your guidance, then you have to wear it, and you need the resilience and kind of, you know, to brave up and say, yeah, it's mine, I take it, to a point we're just doing that we'd agreed, but this was my risk, and therefore I will live with it.
Yeah.
And the sort of areas I've gone, I always kind of keep in the back of your mind is it's more about making everyone else successful, because if they're successful, inevitably you will be. And it means that people are willing probably to go the extra mile that needs to happen at some point with the endeavor. And that endeavor is the thing that you're there to help ensure that you've defined and it's realistic and achievable, and also redirect it, because, you know, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that's true in any walk of life. It's merely a basis for change, and you're there as the conductor of the orchestra to ensure that you change the beats and point the right instrument at the right time if things are adjusting. And that's both sort of experienced that in the military quite a lot. And I did work with some really good people, actually some exceptional leaders, but not a high count of them. And then I've come across, I think, in some cases more impressive leadership within commercial enterprise, where the challenges can be far greater because there's this, people finish at 5 or 6 at night and go to another life, and you've got to try and manage around that. Where in the military, you're all normally in a metal box or stuck on a field.
You're in.
It's hard for the pressure point because it's bombs and bullets, but it's easy to keep everyone aligned because it's really obvious what the aims and objectives are, less so in business.
Can I just jump in, Alex? I love that, you know, what you say about own the failure and credit the success to the team. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think one of the challenges we face, particularly in the software industry, so apologies to anybody who's not in the software industry, but is right now the economic climate is driving the wrong behaviors at the top. And I've been talking about this all year. So, for example, boards or CEOs or whoever will set a budget for next year and says we're going to grow 30%. That's based on nothing, right? It's just based
on a spreadsheet.
Sorry?
It's based on a spreadsheet.
Exactly.
Put a number in there.
But when you get halfway through the year, and Sastra, who are a reporting body in the SaaS industry, the software as a service industry, produced a report at the end of June, beginning of July, that said 70% of all salespeople in SaaS were at less than 50% of target year to date. Now, does that mean 70% of the sales force are useless? Or does that mean that in 70% of cases, somebody set a target that wasn't achievable? And the best way to destroy a high-performing team is give them a target that's not achievable. Yeah, if you say, I mean, I'll use a military analogy. You send a group of 10 men to take on an army, you're going to lose. It's pretty straightforward. Unless you happen to be carrying a big nuclear, but you're basically going to lose, which meant you were set an objective that wasn't achievable.
Well, that's...
And I think we have as an industry been setting our teams up to fail. And, you know, that's
it's not just the tech industry either. You know, a lot of sectors are struggling at the moment and will be in a similar situation. So, you know,
was I think great,
yeah,
you know, good leadership and the way to get a team really performing is to say, okay, let's look at all the market conditions. And we might decide that this year is 2023, and in the built environment, Bronnie, you get this, as you, Mickey, in the built environment, this is the worst we've had it for years. Maybe flat is not a bad result. You know, maybe no growth, but no shrinkage is a good result. And I know that's certainly true in our space. You know, I'm sure, Bronnie, hopefully you'd agree. Lots of prop techs would take flat this year. 10% growth might be exceptional.
Yeah.
But if we keep piling numbers on based on spreadsheets, as Mickey says,
you'll lose your team.
Yeah.
And then when market conditions change, you haven't got a team in place to make the most of it. Bronnie, I'd like to ask you. You talked, going back to a point you mentioned earlier about sort of retaining your people and building a team. Is there something you're doing when you're actually recruiting these people and looking for and selecting them to help improve that quality of retention, or how, you know, over and above, you know, the purpose and giving the team the things that you have power of with the existing team? Is there anything you're doing at the earlier stage where you, and this goes to Mickey and David, what do you consider at that point to help increase or get that match right for the people that are coming in? And you know, this might tie into the, you know, the diversity question that Taz asked earlier as well.
It's definitely, I mean, recruitment, I mean, you're in this space, Alex. It's really tough, right? And you go into, you know, looking to fill a role with a whole lot of, you know, a big list of things that you need that person to be able to do. This is the ideal candidate that we're looking for. I think what I found is you need to be a little flexible about that and be open to people that are maybe more experienced in a slightly different area or coming from a different industry sometimes, to get someone who's really going to be a star performer. And that means being open to adjust the team that they're going into and reshuffling a bit, and not being particularly hard and fast about it. Obviously, there's core competencies that you need for someone coming into that role, but being a little bit open. And I think it's also, you know, important. Everybody says we're looking for someone that ticks these boxes, is in a good cultural fit. And I think that's a bit of a trap of hiring people like us, right? And so, yes, you want someone who's a good cultural fit, but do they need to be like you or like everybody else in the team? Absolutely not. And it's important to dive into the way that people work and the culture that they're going to enjoy working in, the types of leadership that they respond well to, and making sure that aligns with how we work. You know, at Equium, if someone says, I need a huge amount of structure and I need a daily task list of what I need to achieve today, and I want to check in with my manager at the end of every week, that's probably not going to be the right place for them with Equium, and they're probably looking for a larger organization that doesn't move as quickly. So that part of the culture is really important, to make sure that way that we work and the way that we operate is going to work for someone coming in. But I think as you know, we found that broadening our search criteria allows us to get candidates in that pool from more diverse backgrounds. And there's a real difference between hiring for diversity and looking to build out the team versus a diversity hire where we say we're hiring someone specifically because they tick a box, and that's just never going to work for you, and it's not a great long-term strategy for building diversity in a company. But making sure that we're looking at a diverse pool of candidates, and that in our hiring panel, that we also have some diversity. We never have just a line manager hiring a resource. We have a number of people from different areas in the business and from potentially different backgrounds, skill sets, etc., to help us make those decisions about who's going to be the right fit. But, you know, the hiring process is critical. And in terms of, you know, the early stages of team building and bringing that person into a team and hopefully having them contribute to a high performing team, for me, a lot of that comes down to, you know, doing some profiling and understanding, you know, who everybody is in the team, how they communicate, how they work, where they're best operating. And we do, you know, DISC profiling, we do TMS for all of our staff, Skills Finder, all of these types of things that we do with individuals and with teams, 360 reviews, to understand where people best sit in that team. And to, you know, if people have self-awareness, it's the first step in being able to create high trust. People understand this is how I communicate, to be able to talk about that and say, hey, I'm pretty introverted. When you're asking me an important question, I'd like some time to think about it before I respond. Or for me, I'm a really direct person. I forget some of the pleasantries and go straight in with my questions. But to be able to talk about that as a team is really important for me and for our team. So we talk about that a lot with new people when they come in.
I think the
So it's getting
diversity
the-
question's really interesting, and we, I mean, Mickey and I, when we first met, talked about this as well. But it's about, for me, it's we've almost got too hung up on the gender, ethnicity type diversity thought process. For me, it's about diversity in skill set, diversity in experience. You know, the gender bit, the ethnicity, the sexual preference, I think that's almost irrelevant if you come back to just having diversity of experiences, because that's where teams really learn from each other. You know, I haven't got the same experiences as a 28-year-old. Not in today's society. My 28-year-old days were very different to the 28-year-old days today. But the thought process, the thought process people go through do change as you gain more experience and age and whatever it might be. And everybody can, it comes back to what we said earlier, everybody can learn off everybody.
I agree with you, Dave. In terms of building teams and getting success, I believe that, you know, diversity of thought and skills and backgrounds. But I also think that we have a moral obligation to make sure that we are getting people from minority groups into our recruitment processes, so that they are getting that opportunity, and when they come through the door, that they're getting the opportunities to progress. Because otherwise, if we don't actively think about those things, I think we risk not doing it, and we don't shift the needle of where we are today, which, look at us all
I do agree with you that the challenge is getting them into the process.
Yeah.
I've done some.
It can't be a diversity hire. It's not going to work to say we're out looking for a minority to come in and, you know, change the diversity in the team. It has to be that we're widening our search, and we're changing our practices so that we're still choosing the best person for the job, but it doesn't need to be either or, right?
Yeah. No, I agree with that completely.
Yeah, it's just being aware that you can have, you know, there's unconscious biases, affinity bias, you know, where you like people that are like you because they're from similar backgrounds, you've got things in common. Yeah. It's just being aware that these are pressure, you know, subconscious and, you know, primeval pressures to be part of a group and have an affinity with someone. And that might be driving some of your decisions when you're selecting. So it's important to have, you know, other people in the process, like you say, Bronnie, to just make sure you're covering those potential sort of pitfalls.
To agree with you, though, Dave, I agree that when we talk about diversity, we tend to talk about those things, and we miss diversity of age and neurodiversity and physical ability. That stuff is hugely important to building diverse teams as well.
Yeah, and actually, you said it earlier, Mickey. I'd love to get rid of this phrase "pale, male, and stale," because I am.
Unfortunately, it's there for a reason. Industries have been male dominated, and it's people of an age. There's coming to the overall point. I don't know if anyone's ever saw. There's a really good case study where you saw an industry overcome the challenges of no biases for engaging with diversity. And it was the greatest shortening of gender pay gap, because there was a business need. And therefore the leadership looked at the need and went, we're getting hung up on targets and blah, blah, blah. What we need to do is we need to adjust the way we operate so anyone can do the job.
Yeah.
And you went, that's the way you do it. And it was the mining industry, because previously it was probably people built a bit more like me and David, because you needed to drive a 15-ton wagon or you're out on a site with cranes. And yet technology, change of process, and actually a re-engagement with a whole labor force brought the mining industry back to profitability, because it wasn't. And it was kind of forced on Rio Tinto. It actually came from the sort of engineer designers down in Australia, because they were working in Kazakhstan and in South America. And what they looked at was that you had higher female indigenous populations who weren't working. And if you could make the industry function for them, you had this untapped labor pool. And therefore the need drove a change to them becoming really diverse employers. And it wasn't to try and become a diverse employer. It was, that was the labor pool. How do we get them to do the job so we can make money? And actually, if we change the lens and go, why aren't we getting the right mix of people wanting to come into a specific industry? It'll be because of the way it's operating. So be bold and look at adjusting the operating methods so therefore it becomes accessible by all. And again, that mining one is really interesting, because it was a business need that forced a change that actually worked out for everyone.
I love that.
Fantastic. Well, I think on that point we'll wrap it up now. The hour is done. Thank you so much, everyone who's took part and asked questions. Sorry if I didn't manage to ask yours, and thank you so much to the panel for being part of it. It's really been a really insightful and engaging discussion. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye.